"That's Evelyn," she dropped out. She'd say it with a little sigh, a tilt of the head, like I was a repair she kept meaning to get to. Then she'd turn to my brother and her whole face would open up. "And this is Brandon. He's an attorney now. 2 children. One a diploma, one a disappointment." I stopped correcting her a long time ago. This past Thanksgiving, at that same long table, with the same wobbly chair waiting for me at the end, I finally understood why. What happened at that dinner didn't go the way anyone expected, least of all me, and the part that still keeps me up isn't what my mother said. It's what she did after. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the quiet ones tell the stories the loud ones hoped they'd forget, and where the last laugh is usually the softest one in the room. If you've ever been the family disappointment who knew something they didn't, this one's for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Every gathering in our family was a small performance, and my mother was the director. She had a way of arranging people the second they walked through the door. Brandon got the seat near the head of the table. Brandon got the first plate, the first question, the first round of proud looks. I got the folding chair at the end, the one that wobbled on the uneven floorboard by the kitchen. It became a ritual. A cousin would arrive, and Mom would sweep her arm toward my brother first. "You remember Brandon, law school, top of his class." Then, almost as an afterthought, her eyes would find me. "And Evelyn, she's still figuring things out." I'd nod. I'd pass the rolls. I'd say nothing, because saying something was always worse. Every relative in that room believed my mother's version of me completely. Why wouldn't they? She told it with such confidence, year after year, that it hardened into fact. What none of them knew, what I'd made sure none of them knew, was that I had figured things out a long time ago. I just wasn't in the mood to hand them the answer. Not yet. Because the answer was mine, and the moment I put it on that table, it would stop being mine. It would become a story my mother told, in her words, at her volume, arranged the way she arranged everything. I'd watched her do it to every good thing that ever crossed that threshold. So I let the folding chair stay wobbly, I let the label stay stuck, and I went to work. The label got stamped on a Tuesday night in October, 6 years before all of this. I sat at my parents' kitchen table and told them I wasn't going back for my 3rd year of college. I'd found something better, I said. A trade, a shop, real work with my hands that I was already good at. My father looked down into his coffee and stayed there. My mother set her fork down very slowly, the way you set down something you might otherwise throw across a room. "A shop," she repeated. Not a question, a verdict. She didn't yell. My mother never yelled. She went quiet and cold instead, and the cold settled in and stayed for years. Within a week, she'd told the neighbors I'd hit a rough patch. She told her sister I'd lost my way. She told the ladies at church I was taking some time. She never once asked what the shop actually was, or what I actually did there, or whether I was happy. The story was already written the moment I said the word, shop. That was the last real conversation we ever had about my life. Everything after it was just performance. On a stage she controlled. What stung wasn't that she was disappointed. Parents get disappointed. That's allowed. It was that she never got curious. Not once in 6 years did she ask to see the shop, or a part I'd made, or a paycheck I'd earned. Curiosity would have meant admitting there might be a story she didn't already know the ending to. And my mother did not admit that about anything, least of all her children. So the verdict stood, unappealed, and I quit filing motions. The shop was called Delgado Metal Works, tucked at the dead end of an industrial road in Cedar County, and I loved it before I understood why. It smelled like cutting oil and hot steel and coffee, left too long on the burner. Hank Delgado owned it, 63 years old, hands like tree bark, a laugh you could hear over a running lathe. My first month, he handed me a broom and watched me sweep. My 3rd month, without a word, he handed me a set of calipers. "You measure twice," he said. "You'll never have to explain once." I turned out to be good at it. Not okay. Good. I could read a drawing and see the finished part in my head before the metal was even loaded. I could hear when a cut was wrong. Hank noticed things like that. By the end of my first year, he pulled me off cleanup and put me on a real contract, a run of parts for a machine shop 2 counties over. Run this one, he said, and walked away, which from Hank was a standing ovation. I stayed late that night just to get it perfect. It scared me how much I wanted to. I'd spent 2 years in college feeling like a passenger in my own life, memorizing things I'd never use for a career I couldn't picture. The shop was the opposite of that. Everything I learned there, I used the next day. Every mistake I made showed up in metal I could hold and fix. There was no hiding, and there was no faking, and I loved it for exactly those reasons. For the first time, I woke up wanting to get somewhere. I just made the mistake, once, of telling my mother that. She heard garage. I heard home. We were never talking about the same place. My grandmother called me every Sunday without fail. Nan. Rosalind on her mail. Nan to everyone who loved her. She was the only person in the whole family who asked about the shop like it was a good thing, not a phase. Tell me what you made this week, she'd say, and she actually meant it. I'd describe a bracket, a housing, a run of parts for the water plant, and she'd listen like I was reading her poetry over the phone. One Sunday she said the thing I'd end up carrying for the rest of my life. Evelyn, love, work you can hold in your hands is never a disappointment. Only people are. She said it plainly, no drama, no lecture, then asked if I was eating enough vegetables. I didn't know yet how much I'd come to need those words, or how many times I'd repeat them to myself in the dark. I only knew that when I hung up the phone, the folding chair at the end of my mother's table stopped feeling like the whole story of who I was. Nan had handed me a second opinion, and I held onto it with both hands. She'd raised 6 kids on a baker's schedule and a widow's budget, and she had no patience for the idea that a diploma was the only proof a person's life was worth anything. Your grandfather couldn't read a lick past the sports page, she told me once, and he built every stair in this house by hand. They're still standing. Where's the man who graded him? I didn't have an answer. Neither did she. That was the point. Brandon passed the bar exam that spring, and my mother threw a party for it. Balloons. A sheet cake with a little sugar gavel on top. She'd printed his photo, framed it, and set it on the mantel where the good frames go, next to the wedding pictures. I brought a bottle of wine and got the folding chair again, wobbly leg and all, near the kitchen door where the cold draft came through. Halfway through dinner, a family friend leaned over and asked what I was doing these days. Before I could get a word out, my mother answered for me, the way she always did. Oh, Evelyn's still at that little metal place. We keep hoping she'll go back and finish something someday. She smiled when she said it. That was the part that got me. Not the words, the smile. It wasn't cruelty. Cruelty I could have argued with. It was something worse than cruelty. It was certainty. She was so sure she was right about me that there was no crack to slide a truth into. I opened my mouth to explain, and then I closed it again. And I decided, right there over the sugar gavel, that I was done explaining myself to that table forever. Explaining had never once worked. Every word I offered up got weighed against Brandon's framed photo on the mantel and found light. So I stopped setting my life down for them to weigh. I drank my wine, I complimented the cake, and I drove back to Cedar County that night to a house I owned and a job that needed me at 6. The draft by the kitchen door could keep the folding chair. I had somewhere better to be. People think silence means you're weak. Mine was the opposite of weak. I'd tried the other way once, and it taught me a lesson I didn't forget. A year earlier, I'd told my mother, carefully, that I'd been promoted to run the shop floor. A real title, real responsibility, people reporting to me. I watched her face do the math and land on the wrong answer entirely. So you're a supervisor at a garage, she said. That's nice, honey. Then she turned and asked Brandon about his internship. That night, I sat in my truck in their driveway and made myself a rule. I would stop telling them anything real, not out of spite, out of self-defense. Every true thing I handed that family came back to me, smaller than when I gave it. So I'd keep the true things somewhere they couldn't shrink them. I'd let them keep their tidy little version of me, the dropout, the cautionary tale. And I'd build the real Evelyn somewhere they weren't looking, brick by brick, part by part. It turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made. It was also the loneliest, and I want to be honest about that. Here is what the family never saw, because they never once looked. By my 3rd year at Delgado, I wasn't the kid with the broom anymore. I was the person Hank called when a job came in that scared everyone else in the shop. Tight tolerances, weird alloys, deadlines that made grown men sweat and quote themselves out of the running. I'd stay late and figure it out, and in the morning the finished part would be sitting on Hank's desk, dead on spec, no excuses. He started bringing customers back to my station himself. "This is Evelyn," he'd tell them, hand on my shoulder. "She'll take care of you." The vendors learned my name. The rep from the water district started asking for me directly when he called in an order. I wasn't lost. I wasn't figuring things out. I was quietly becoming the best fabricator in a 50-mile radius, while my mother told the aunts, over her nice coffee, that I'd wandered off the path and might never find it. Some path. I was pouring the road myself, one long day at a time. There was a run of stainless housings I did that spring for a food processing plant. Tolerances so tight the customer's own engineer drove out to watch me set up the first cut, arms crossed, sure I'd blow it. I didn't. He left me his card and a standing order. Little wins like that stacked up in a drawer nobody in my family would ever open. That was fine. They weren't for the family. They were for me. And for the 12-year-old with the fan who'd figured out early that her hands were smarter than anybody gave them credit for. I lived in 2 separate worlds that never touched each other. In one, I signed off on contracts and shook hands with plant managers who trusted my word like it was bonded. In the other, I sat at holiday tables while relatives asked me, gently, like they were being kind, "So, when are you going to go back and finish, sweetheart?" I learned to answer without ever really answering. "We'll see. Maybe someday." I got very good at the shrug. It cost me something small every single time, but it cost me less than the alternative would have. One Friday evening, Hank leaned in the office doorway while I closed out the week's invoices. He watched me work for a while, not saying anything, which wasn't like him. Then he said something odd. "You ever think about what happens to this place when I'm gone?" I laughed and told him he'd outlive all of us. He didn't laugh back. He just nodded slowly, the way a man does when he's already made a decision and is only waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. I didn't push him on it. In the shop you learn that some things cure like epoxy. You can't rush them without ruining the bond. So I closed out the invoices, shut off the lights, and drove home with the question sitting in the passenger seat next to me. What happens to this place when I'm gone? I turned it over half the night. I told myself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Brandon and his wife had a daughter, Katie, and by the time she was 7, I started watching the family do to her exactly what they'd done to me. She wasn't reading at the same level as her older cousin, so the comparisons began. Soft at first, disguised as kindness. "Well, Katie's more of a hands-on kid," said like a small apology for her. At the Thanksgiving before this one, Katie built a little tower out of dinner rolls and drinking cups, an actual working structure, with a bridge span across 2 water glasses that held. It was clever. It was engineering. And nobody clapped. They asked her cousin to recite a memorized poem instead, and everyone cooed. I watched Katie's face fall by degrees, watched her slide the tower apart before anyone could tell her to, and I saw myself at that age, elbow deep in a broken fan, while the whole room waited for me to become something more acceptable. I knelt down next to her chair and told her, just her, that the tower was the best thing on the whole table. She looked at me like I'd slipped her a secret. I hadn't planned to become anyone's safe adult. It happened anyway. A week after that odd conversation in the office doorway, Hank stopped me as I was heading out to my truck for the night. He wasn't wearing his usual easy smile. "Evelyn," he said, "next week, you and me, We're going to sit down and have a real talk. A serious one. You come in with your head clear." I asked him, half joking, if I'd done something wrong. He shook his head slowly. "Opposite of wrong," he said, and that was all he'd give me. I drove home turning it over the whole way. A raise, maybe. A partnership title on the door. A profit-sharing thing he'd been hinting at. I made a whole list in my head of the small, sensible possibilities, ranked by likelihood, the way I'd size up a job. I was wrong about every single one of them, top to bottom. Because I was thinking small, the way you think when you've spent years being told the ceiling is low. I had no idea that in 7 days, Hank Delgado was about to hand me the rest of my life. Before that talk came a wedding, a cousin's, a big family affair, my mother in her full element in a new dress she'd mentioned 4 times. She found me by the punch bowl and steered me firmly toward a table of relatives I barely knew, out-of-town people, fresh audience. "This is my daughter Evelyn," she announced. "She never finished college, but she's doing just fine at a little shop." One of them gave me the look people give a rescued animal at the shelter. That soft, pitying tilt. A year earlier, that single sentence would have burned in my chest for a solid week. This time, I felt something different underneath the old sting. I felt the discipline I'd built. I could have leveled that entire table with one true sentence about what I actually did, who actually depended on me, what I actually earned. And I chose not to. My silence wasn't cowardice anymore, and it wasn't even really about them. It was a locked vault, and I was the only person alive with the combination. I smiled, refilled my punch, and let her have her story. Mine was almost finished being built. And there's a strange freedom in that. In knowing something so solid that no amount of another person's pity can dent it. The relatives at that table saw a girl in a plain dress who hadn't finished school. I saw 11 paychecks I was about to be responsible for, a bank officer who'd started taking my calls, and an old man 2 counties over quietly deciding to hand me his life's work. Let them look at the dress. I knew what I was wearing underneath it. The talk happened on a Wednesday, in the office, with the machines shut off for lunch and the whole shop strangely quiet. Hank sat across the desk from me and folded his rough hands together on the blotter. "I'm 63, he said, looking me right in the eye. "My knees are shot, my back's worse, and my kids don't want this place. My son sells insurance in Denver and likes it. My daughter's a nurse and she's happy about it and good for her. But that means this shop dies with me unless somebody takes it on." He paused for a long moment, and I felt the air change in the room. "And I want that somebody to be you." I honestly thought I'd misheard him. I asked him to say it again. He did. Slower this time, spelling it out. He wanted to sell me Delgado Metalworks. The whole thing. The building. The machines. The contracts. The name. All of it. "You already run this place," he said, tapping the desk. "I'm just asking you to own what you already carry every day." I sat there with my heart going like a stamping press and not one single word in my mouth. Finally, I managed to ask him why me, not his son, not some outside buyer with cash. Me. He leaned back and looked around the shop through the office window, at the machines he'd bought one at a time over 30 years. "Because you love it the way I love it," he said. "A buyer would strip it for the equipment and sell the building. You'd keep the lights on and keep my people working. I didn't spend my life building this to watch it get parted out." He looked back at me. "You're the only one who'd keep it alive. So it's you, or it's nobody." Then Hank told me the number, and the number brought me back down to earth hard enough to leave a mark. A business like his, real revenue, real equipment, real customers on the books, was not cheap, and I'd known that in the abstract. But hearing it out loud made my mouth go dry. I did not have that kind of money. Nobody I knew had that kind of money. But Hank, it turned out, had already done the homework for me. He walked me through it like a patient teacher walking a nervous student through a hard problem. An SBA loan for the bulk of it. Seller financing for a chunk, meaning he'd carry part of the note himself because he trusted me. A down payment I'd have to scrape together from everything I had. And then, near the end, quietly, the phrase that would follow me into my sleep. A personal guarantee. He said that part carefully, watching my face. It means, if this thing goes bad, Evelyn, the bank can come for what's yours. Your savings. Your house. By then I owned a small house. The one real thing I'd built for myself outside the shop walls. He let that sit in the room between us. It's a real risk. I won't insult you by pretending it isn't. I drove home that night doing math that would not stop running. Down payment against savings. Loan against revenue. Revenue against payroll. Payroll against the one big account I was quietly, privately nervous about. Every road in the math led back to the same intersection. The house. My house. The one thing I owned free and clear. The proof I'd made something of myself, and the exact thing I'd have to put at risk to make something bigger. I pulled into my own driveway and sat there with the engine ticking, looking at the porch light, doing the one calculation that had no clean answer. What is it worth to stop being small in a room you've been small in your whole life? Turns out it's worth exactly one house. I did not tell my family a single word of it. Instead, I told a banker. I put on the one good blazer I owned, the one I kept for funerals and nothing else, and I walked into Cedar County Bank with a folder I'd built over 3 weeks of late nights at the kitchen table. Revenue projections, customer lists with contract values, equipment appraisals, 5 years of the shop's actual numbers, which Hank had handed over to me without so much as a flinch, because he trusted me with the truth of his life's work. The loan officer was a careful, unhurried woman named Pat, and she flipped through my folder twice, front to back, then front again. "You put this together yourself?" she asked, and there was something new in the question. I told her I had. She looked at me differently after that, not like a dropout, not like a girl in a borrowed blazer, but like a borrower who had done the work. She didn't say yes that day. She said, "Let's see what we can do," which in bank language is a maybe with a heartbeat. I walked out to my truck, sat down behind the wheel and shook. Not from fear exactly, from the sheer size of the thing I'd just reached for. I'd walked into that bank braced to be talked down to, the way I'd been talked down to at every family table for 6 years. Instead, a stranger had looked at my numbers and taken me seriously in a way my own mother never had. It cracked something open in me, sitting in that truck. If a bank could see it, if Pat, who owed me nothing, could look at 5 years of records and see a real business run by a real professional, then maybe the problem had never been the work at all. Maybe it had only ever been the audience. There was one night I nearly told my parents everything. I had the phone right in my hand, my thumb over my mother's name. I pictured driving over, spreading the folder across their kitchen table, watching their faces finally change into something like respect. Some tired, hopeful part of me wanted their help, a cosigner, a loan, even just advice from someone who loved me. And then I remembered the last time I'd shown that family something I was proud of, and how it had come back to me shrunk and pitied. Worse than that, I imagined my mother getting her hands into it, wanting a say in decisions she didn't understand, telling the ants before the ink was even dry, turning my quiet, fragile, half-built thing into a family production before it could stand on its own 2 legs. I set the phone face down on the table. If this was going to be mine, it had to be mine all the way to the bottom, including the lonely part where I did it without them. I wasn't hiding out of fear or shame. I was protecting something too young and too important to survive their hands on it. I told Hank yes. Not the yes of a bank yet. That would take more weeks of paperwork. The yes of a person. We sat in that same office and I said the words out loud, plain and steady. "I want to buy the shop." He nodded like he'd known for a month, which he had. We signed a letter of intent that afternoon, one plain page that just said we both meant it and intended to see it through. My hand didn't shake when I signed my name. That surprised me more than anything. Somewhere in the years between the folding chair at my mother's table and that worn desk, I had quietly become a person who could put her name on a serious page and mean it. The girl who dropped out was about to own a company with employees and contracts and a name over the door. The question I'd carried for years. Evelyn, what are you even doing down there? Finally had an answer. But a new question opened up underneath it, sharper than the old one. Could I actually pull this off? Or was I about to prove my mother right in the most expensive, most public way a person possibly could? That question moved into my chest that afternoon, and it didn't leave. Every night after, I'd lie awake running the two futures side by side. In one, I owned a shop, made payroll, held my head up at any table in the county. In the other, I lost the house, lost the savings, and handed my mother the ending she'd been narrating for years. See? I told everyone. I told them all along. I signed the letter of intent anyway. Sometimes the only way out of a fear is straight through the middle of it. Then Nan got sick, and it came on fast the way it does with the old and the stubborn. One Sunday she didn't sound like herself on the phone. Her voice was thinner, and she lost the thread of her own story twice. The next week she was in the hospital, small against the white sheets, an IV taped to the back of a hand that had needed 10,000 loaves of bread in its life. I started coming every evening after the shop closed, driving over with the day's grit still under my nails. My family cycled through during the daylight hours, brief, dutiful visits, then back out to their lives. One of those evenings I came in and heard my mother out in the hallway on her phone, telling someone in a bright, proud voice all about Brandon's first big case. I heard the whole thing through the door. Inside the room, Nan was awake, and she reached over and squeezed my fingers with what strength she had left, and she asked me the same thing she always asked. "Tell me what you made this week, love." So I told her. About the shop. About the loan. About all of it. She was the first person in my family I told the truth to. And she didn't flinch at the size of it, or ask if I was sure, or remind me of the risk the way everyone sensible would have. She just held my hand tighter and said, "Of course you're buying it. Who else would?" Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like the only strange part was that it had taken this long. In that hospital room, with the machines counting down her heartbeats, my grandmother was the one person who treated my impossible thing as simply inevitable. I have thought about that 1,000 times since. Belief like that is rarer than money, and it lasts longer. She was lucid one night near the end, more herself than she'd been in a week, sharp-eyed in the dim room while the machines hummed their soft, endless songs around us. I told her the whole thing that night, everything. The price, the personal guarantee, the house on the line, and the fear I hadn't said out loud to anyone that I was about to fail spectacularly in front of every single person who already expected it of me. She listened the way she always had, like I was reading her poetry. When I finally ran out of words, she was quiet for a while. Then she said it again, the thing from all those Sunday phone calls, but slower now, and heavier, like she was pressing it into me to keep. Work you can hold in your hands is never a disappointment. Only people are. And then she added something new, something I didn't have yet. Don't you dare buy that shop to prove them wrong, Evelyn. You buy it because it's yours. Because you want it. Not for that table. She patted my hand once. Promise me that. I promised her. It was the last real conversation the two of us ever had. The deal moved forward, and Nan faded at the same time, 2 clocks in my life running down at different speeds, and I couldn't stop either one. I hired a lawyer to handle the closing, and no, not Brandon. God, never Brandon. I found a plain business attorney 2 towns over who charged by the hour, kept his opinions to himself, and had never once heard my family's version of me. We did the due diligence together, methodical and slow. An appraiser walked the shop floor and confirmed the equipment values, machine by machine. The bank firmed up the loan terms. A closing date got penciled onto a calendar for late in the fall. I kept the entire thing sealed off from my family, an entire second life running quietly in parallel to the one where I was still, officially, at every dinner, the girl who never finished anything. I know a lot of you are hearing this and thinking of one relative who only ever saw the worst version of you. Hold that thought, hit subscribe, and stay with me, because what my mother did at that table is coming, and I promise you it's not what you think. Nan died on a Thursday morning, and my mother's very first phone call to me wasn't about grief. It was about arrangements. Who would sit where? Which relatives would take offense at which flowers? How the whole thing would look to the people watching. At the funeral, she moved through the room like a hostess at one of her parties, straightening people's postures with her eyes, managing the grief of others so it stayed presentable. I stood at the back and let the loss go through me like cold river water. After the service, my mother's sister found me and pressed a small tin box into my hands, an old cookie tin, dented at one corner. "Rosalind wanted you to have this," she said quietly. "Only you." She was very clear about that. I opened it that night, alone at my kitchen table with the house dark and silent around me. Inside was a photograph of me at 12 years old, elbow deep in a broken box fan, tongue caught between my teeth in fierce concentration. And underneath it, an IOU in Nan's shaky handwriting for $200, for work well done. Nan. She'd paid me for fixing that fan when I was a kid, and she'd kept the receipt for 15 years. I remembered that fan. It had died in the middle of an August heat wave, and my father was going to throw it out, and 12-year-old me had asked to take it apart first. I found the seized bearing, cleaned it, packed it, put the whole thing back together on the kitchen floor while Nan watched over her reading glasses. When it spun back to life, she'd clapped like I'd performed surgery, and then, dead serious, she'd pressed 2 crumpled $100 bills into my hand. "Work well done gets paid," she'd said. I'd forgotten it completely. She never had. She'd carried the proof of me in a cookie tin for 15 years, waiting, I think, for the day I'd need to be reminded. I cried for the first time in a very long time, sitting there at my kitchen table with that tin open in front of me. Not the kind of crying that breaks a person down, the kind that sets a person, the way heat sets a weld. She had believed in the work of my hands since I was 12 years old, since before I even knew it was worth believing in. Back when every other adult in my life was still politely waiting for me to become someone more acceptable. I thought about her last instruction to me, the one she'd made me promise. Don't buy the shop to prove them wrong. Buy it because it's yours. For 7 long years, my mother's approval had been the secret scoreboard I was playing to, even when I told myself I wasn't. Every late night, every perfect part, some hidden part of me was keeping score against that table. And Nan, with her dented tin and her 15-year-old receipt, had just handed me a completely different game to play. I put the photo and the IOU back in the tin and set it right next to my keys, where I would see it every single morning on my way out. Then I called my lawyer and told him to keep the closing exactly on schedule. I wasn't doing it for the table anymore. I was doing it for the 12-year-old with the fan. And once I'd said that to myself, out loud in the empty kitchen, something loosened in my chest that had been clenched for years. The scoreboard I'd been secretly playing to, my mother's face finally changing, the aunts finally impressed, went dark and quiet. It had never been a game I could win, because she held the pen and she'd already written the score. Nan had shown me a truer thing. You don't build a life to change somebody's opinion of you. You build it because the building is the point. I closed the tin, and I felt, for the first time, like the work was finally mine, and mine alone. At the reception after the funeral, in my parents' living room, my mother introduced me to a distant cousin who'd driven in from out of state. Even there, even on that day, with Nan barely in the ground, she reached for the same old script without even thinking about it. "This is Evelyn. She's still trying to find her footing, poor thing. Bless her heart." I felt the familiar heat start to climb up my neck, the old reflex. But something had genuinely shifted in me since I'd opened that tin box. The heat came, and then it went. And it left me standing there steady instead of stung. I looked at my mother, at the grief she was managing so carefully in front of the guests, at the way she needed every person in the room arranged just so, and for one strange, unexpected second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because she'd spent her entire life being judged and ranked by people exactly like the relatives filling that room, and somewhere along the way she'd learned to survive it by handing them her children as proof she'd done all right. I understood it completely. I just wasn't willing to be anyone's proof anymore. So I said nothing at all, and I let her finish her sentence. Then I went home and read my closing documents until the words blurred. The night before I signed, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat at the kitchen table with the personal guarantee laid out in front of me under the light, and I read it 3 separate times. In plain, flat English, it said the thing I already knew. If the shop failed, the bank could take my savings and my house. The little house I'd bought with the first real money I ever earned with my own hands. The only place on earth that was entirely, completely mine. I ran the numbers one more time, the way you press on a bruise just to check if it still hurts. The shop was solid. I knew that better than anyone alive, better than the bank did. The customers were real, and the work was good. But I also knew the math had no cushion in it. One big account walking out the door. One bad year. One thing I couldn't see coming from where I stood. And I would lose everything. And I would become, in the most literal and public way possible, exactly what my mother had told everyone I already was. I looked over at Nan's tin by my keys. I looked at the 12-year-old with the fan, so sure of what her hands could do. Then I turned off the light and eventually, I slept. The weekend before the closing, Katie was over at my parents' house when I stopped by to drop off a casserole dish my mother had loaned me. Katie found me out in the driveway, away from all the adults, and she asked me a question that knocked the wind clean out of me. "Aunt Evelyn," she said in that quiet, careful voice kids use when they've been working up to something, "does it make you sad when Grandma tells people you dropped out?" 7 years old, she'd been listening the whole time, at every dinner, the exact same way I used to listen at her age. I crouched down to her level right there on the cold driveway. For a second I thought about lying to her, telling her it didn't bother me at all. But she deserved better than that, and so did I. So I told her the truth, the useful part of it, the part I'd fought 7 years to earn. "For a long time it did," I said. "It hurt a lot. But then I learned something really important. Nobody gets to grade your life but you. Not a teacher, not a grandma, not anybody. You remember that the next time they compare you to your cousin, okay? You're the only one holding the red pen." She nodded, solemn as a little judge, and squeezed my hand exactly the way Nan used to. I stood back up feeling like I'd just handed something precious down a line. Because here was the thing I understood now that I hadn't at her age. The label doesn't stop with you. It gets passed. Katie was next. There was already a cousin she was measured against, already a poem she couldn't recite, already a soft apologizing tone in how the adults described her. I'd spent 7 years learning how to survive that machine. If I couldn't turn it off, I could at least teach one small person how to stand inside it without believing a word it said. That felt, right then, more important than the shop, the loan, the whole thing. The morning of the closing, I stood on the sidewalk outside Cedar County Bank in my one good blazer with Nan's tin tucked into my bag for luck. My lawyer was already inside at the conference table. Hank was on his way over, coming to sign away the thing he'd built his life around and hand it to me. Through the big front window I could see the table, the stack of documents an inch thick, the pen laid across the top. In 1 hour I would walk in there a fabricator and walk back out an owner, or a fool, depending entirely on how the next several years chose to go. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my mother, of all things, at that exact moment. "Brunch Sunday. Brandon has news about making partner. Do try to be there for once." I read it twice, standing there with my hand already on the cold brass door handle to the biggest decision of my entire life. One signature, and there was no going back to being nobody's disappointment, no more hiding in the safe anonymous dark. It would be my name on the line now, win or lose, sink or swim, all of it mine. I put the phone away without answering, and I pulled the door open, and I walked in. The closing took 90 minutes, and it changed the shape of my whole life. I signed my name more times than I could count. The note, the security agreement, the transfer of the business, the deed to the building. And then, near the end, the page that mattered more than all the others, the personal guarantee. When the pen touched that particular line, I felt the floor of my old life quietly drop away beneath me. There was no undoing it after that, no walking it back. If the shop went down, it would take my house and my savings down with it, and my mother's whole long prophecy about me would come true with interest compounded. Hank signed his half with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and he slid the keys across the table to me, the same worn ring I'd watched him carry on his belt for years. "It's yours now, Evelyn," he said, and his voice cracked clean in half on the word yours. Pat the loan officer shook my hand across the table and, smiling, called me Ms. Walsh, owner. I walked out into the cold November air with the keys clenched tight in my fist and my knees like water underneath me. I owned it, and God help me, it owned me right back. Owning a shop is nothing at all like the fantasy of it. The fantasy is a nameplate on a door and a nice feeling in your chest. The reality is a stack of other people's lives that lands square on your chest at 4 in the morning and sits there. I had 11 employees now, real people, with kids in school and mortgages and health insurance that ran straight through me and my decisions. I had a payroll to make every 2 weeks, whether the money had come in yet or not, whether I'd slept or not. I had a loan payment the size of a family's rent due every single month like clockwork. Hank stayed on for 1 month to help me through the transition, patiently handing over the last of what was in his head, and then he shook my hand, climbed in his truck, and drove off to go fishing like he'd earned. That first month completely on my own, I learned that being the best fabricator in 50 miles and being a boss who people depend on are two entirely different jobs, and now I had to do both of them at the same time. All day. Every day. I didn't tell my family any of it. Sunday brunch came and went. I skipped it. Brandon made partner. I mailed a card. Meanwhile, I was learning things they teach you in no classroom. How to read a cash flow crunch 3 weeks before it lands. How to tell a good welder his work isn't good enough without breaking him. How to look a nervous employee in the eye on payday and promise the check is coming when you're not entirely sure yourself. I kept Hank's chair in the office and sat in it every morning before the crew came in, drinking bad coffee, going over the books. Some mornings the weight of it made it hard to breathe. Then the machines would start up out on the floor. That big familiar hum, and I'd remember why I'd wanted this. It was hard. It was also the first thing that had ever fit me exactly. Then, in early October, the ground shifted under me without warning. Our single biggest customer was a regional equipment manufacturer, I'll call them Ridgeline, and they accounted for nearly 40% of everything we did in a given month. Their orders paid the loan. Their orders made payroll possible. So when their purchasing manager, a man I'd worked with smoothly for 2 years, suddenly stopped returning my calls, my stomach dropped straight through the floor. I told myself it was nothing. A busy season. A vacation. A reorganization that would sort itself out. But I'd been reading people and reading drawings for long enough to know exactly when a signal meant real trouble was coming. Something had been off in the tone of the last email I'd gotten from them. Something too smooth, too polite, too final around the edges. I pulled up our numbers that night and looked at them without Ridgeline in the column, and the math didn't close. It didn't come close to closing. I stayed late in the office that used to be Hank's, staring at the account list under the desk lamp, waiting for a call that never came, and I felt the whole thing I'd just bet everything on start to tilt sideways. The email came on a Tuesday, and I can still feel the exact weight of it. It was 4 lines long, and it took the biggest account we had, 40% of everything, right out the door with it. Ridgeline had been bought by a larger firm, they explained politely, and that larger firm had its own in-house fabrication division. Effective immediately, they would be winding down all outstanding orders with us. They thanked me for my years of service. They wished me the very best in my future endeavors. I read it 3 times, and each time I read it, the numbers in my head got worse, not better. I sat down in Hank's old chair, the one that still smelled faintly like him, and I did the math on losing my house. Payroll in 9 days. The loan payment 2 weeks behind that. Without Ridgeline, I could maybe cover one of those 2 things, not both, and certainly not for more than a month or 2. This was the thing I couldn't see coming from where I'd stood on the sidewalk. This was the one bad break that would make my mother write about me, in front of everyone, forever. I put my head down on that desk, and for about 10 minutes, I let myself feel the whole weight of it. Every worst voice I'd ever swallowed came back at once, and most of them sounded like my mother. She'd been right. I'd bet the house on a garage and I was going to lose it. I could already hear how she'd tell it at the next dinner, gentle and devastating. Poor Evelyn. She tried. We did try to warn her. 11 people were going to lose their jobs because I'd reached above my station. That was the story writing itself in my head while my forehead pressed against the cool wood of Hank's old desk. For 10 minutes, I let it win. Then the 10 minutes were up. Then I picked my head back up off the desk, because 10 minutes was every second I could afford to spend down there. My very first instinct, the old childhood one, was to call my parents. Tell them. Ask for help. And I actually reached for the phone and got my thumb over my mother's name before I fully understood how completely useless that phone call would be. What would they even do? My mother didn't know what a fabrication contract was or how one worked. My father would go quiet and change the subject the moment it smelled like conflict, and Brandon, my brother the attorney, would take one careful look at my personal guarantee and tell me, gently and correctly, that I'd made a reckless bet with my whole life, which was the one single thing I needed no living person to say to me right then. All my life, I'd wanted their approval like it was the air I breathed, and here, at the exact moment my life was truly on the line, that approval was worth precisely nothing. It couldn't make a single part. It couldn't land a single customer. The only thing on earth that could actually save me now was the very thing they'd spent 7 years pitying and calling a disgrace. My own 2 hands. So I used them. I'd heard, a few weeks back, about a rush job that had been bouncing around the whole region and finding no takers, a run of specialized parts for a municipal water plant, a brutal tight tolerance job on a deadline that 3 other shops had already looked at and turned down flat as impossible. I called the plant's chief engineer myself, directly, no middleman. I told him I could do it, and do it right, in 72 hours. He was skeptical, and honestly, I would have been too, hearing it from a shop he'd never used. But I'd built my entire quiet reputation on exactly this kind of impossible, and Hank's name still opened doors when I said I'd trained under him and learned every hard lesson at his elbow. He gave me the shot. For the next 3 days, I barely left the building. I ran the machines myself, hands on the metal, checking every single part twice the way Nan's 15-year-old IOU had taught me to. I slept 2 hours a night on the office couch and ate standing up. On the 3rd day, right at the deadline, I delivered the parts. Dead on spec. Not one out of tolerance. The engineer looked them over slowly, then looked up at me and said, "Who else around here can do work like this?" I told him the truth. Not many, and none of them faster. He laughed, but he'd stopped being skeptical somewhere around the 2nd part he inspected. Before I left, he walked me over to meet the plant manager, and the plant manager shook my hand like I'd already done him a favor. On the drive back to the shop, I had to pull over once, just for a minute, hands still shaking from 3 days of no sleep and one enormous gamble that had, against every voice in my head, actually landed. I'd saved it. Alone. With my hands. I sat on the shoulder of the county road and let myself laugh until it turned into something else. That one question saved my company. The water plant added me to their approved vendor list on the spot. And better than that, the engineer made a few phone calls to people he knew and trusted in the county. Within a month, I'd replaced most of what Ridgeline had taken when they left. But this time not with one big fragile account that could vanish in a 4-line email. This time with a wide spread of smaller, solid, loyal accounts that would never all walk out the same door on the same Tuesday. The shop steadied under me. Payroll cleared. The loan payment cleared. I hadn't just survived the blow. I'd come out the other side with something sturdier and smarter than the thing I'd originally bought. And I had done it completely alone, using the one skill every single person in my family had spent years pitying me for. The strangest part of all of it was how quiet the victory felt inside me. There was no one to call and tell. Or rather, there was no one I wanted to tell in that old, hungry, prove them all wrong way anymore. For the first time in my life, the success was simply, cleanly, mine. And it was enough. I sat in Hank's chair that night with the new orders spread across the desk and did the math one more time. But this time it closed. It closed with room to spare. 30 jobs held, the loan current, the house safe. I'd walked right up to the edge my mother had always predicted for me, looked over it, and walked back on my own power. Nobody had rescued me. Nobody had co-signed a thing. The only tools in the whole rescue had been the ones she pitied. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a minute, just breathing, letting myself believe it. If you've ever fixed something with your own 2 hands while someone told you you'd amount to nothing, you already know exactly what kept me standing. Drop a "still standing" in the comments so I know you're here with me. In early November, a reporter called the shop's front line and asked for me by name. Her name was Dana, and she wrote a business column for the regional paper and posted to the county's little news site besides. Somebody over at the Water District had tipped her off to a story. A young woman had bought out old Hank Delgado's shop, saved the place from closing its doors for good, landed a growing roster of new contracts, and kept 30 jobs alive in a county that couldn't afford to lose them. 30. We'd grown to 30. It's a good story, honestly, Dana told me over the phone. People around here love this kind of thing, especially right now. I hesitated on my end of the line. I had spent 7 full years building this precise thing specifically because no one was watching me do it. Going public with it felt like voluntarily taking off armor I'd worn so long it had fused to my skin. But she wasn't wrong that it was a good story. And more to the point, it wasn't only my story to keep quiet. It was Hank's legacy carrying on. It was 30 families' paychecks. So I told her I'd think about it, and I meant it, and I turned it over in my head for 2 solid days. I said yes to the interview in the end, but not for the reason you'd probably guess. I didn't say yes to show anybody up. I said yes for Hank, who deserved to see his shop's name printed in the paper one more time before he got too old and too far into retirement to care about such things. And I said yes for the 30 people whose steady jobs the article would quietly celebrate. I sat down with Dana for a full hour and talked about the work, the water plant, the 72 hours, Hank's calipers, and his one good piece of advice about measuring twice. I barely mentioned my family at all, and to her credit, she didn't push me on it. When we'd finished and she was packing up her recorder, I asked her, as casually as I could manage, when the piece would run. Late November, she said, cheerful. Right around the holiday. It's a feel-good story, perfect timing for it. I asked, very carefully, whether it might be able to run just a little bit later than that. Editorial had already slotted it, she said, apologetic. It was locked in. I hung up the phone and did the quiet math on the calendar in my head, and my stomach did one slow, sick roll. Late November, around the holiday. The one single holiday my entire family gathered at one long table. 2 days after that, my mother called with the Thanksgiving invitation, and her voice carried its usual weather system. It'll be at our house, naturally. Brandon's bringing the whole family down. He's officially made partner now. Did I tell you that already? We're all just so proud of him. Then a small pause. You should come, Evelyn. Everyone always asks where you are. Everyone always asks where you are, as though I were the one who had walked away from all of them, and not the other way around. I very nearly said no. I had 100 good reasons lined up and ready, but some stubborn thread deep in me, maybe the exact same one that had signed that personal guarantee without shaking, wanted to sit in that room one more time. Not to fight anyone, not to reveal a single thing, just to sit in the wobbly folding chair at the end of the table as the person I had actually, quietly become, and to see with my own eyes how that felt. "I'll be there," I told her. She sounded almost startled to hear it. I hung up the phone with no idea at all that a locked news story and a family dinner were about to arrive at the very same table, at the very same hour. If I'd known, I might have made an excuse. I've asked myself since whether I'd have wanted to, because part of me, a part I don't love but won't lie about, had spent 7 years hoping for exactly this. A day the truth would come out on its own, without me lifting a finger, and there'd be no way for anyone to shrink it or reframe it or file it under poor Evelyn. I just always pictured that I'd feel triumphant when it came. I never once pictured what it would ask of me instead. The night before Thanksgiving, I sat alone in my little house, the one I'd put on the line and somehow managed to keep. And I understood with total, sober clarity that Dana's article could go live at absolutely any moment, any hour. Maybe in the morning, maybe right in the middle of dinner. And sitting there in the quiet, I made a decision that genuinely surprised me. I decided to do nothing with it. Nothing at all. I wouldn't bring my phone out at the table. I wouldn't steer the conversation anywhere near the shop. I wouldn't hand anybody the paper and sit back to watch their faces rearrange themselves. If the story came out at that table, then it would come out entirely on its own, without my hand on it. I wasn't driving over there to expose anyone or to win anything. I put Nan's tin in my bag out of pure habit. The photo, the IOU, and I set my alarm for the morning. I wasn't going there to win. I told myself that exact sentence twice on the drive over the next morning, out loud, in the truck. And I almost believed it. Thanksgiving at my parents' house looked exactly the way it had looked my entire life. The good tablecloth, the one that only came out twice a year. The framed photo of Brandon still standing on the mantel where the good frames go. 14 of us crowded around the long table, and my chair, the wobbly one at the very end, right in the path of the kitchen draft, waiting there for me like a name tag with my whole history written on it. My mother was in full form, sweeping between the kitchen and the dining room, arranging all of us with her eyes as she went. Brandon sat up near the head of the table, holding court about making partner, and the relatives leaned toward him the way houseplants lean toward a bright window. Katie sat halfway down the table, quiet, pushing her green beans around and around her plate in slow circles. Uncle Gary was parked at the far corner, half watching a football game on his phone under the edge of the table, the way he did every single year without fail. I took my seat at the end. I passed the rolls when they came my way, and I felt for the first time in 7 years, completely and strangely calm. Like a person who knows a secret and has decided freely that she doesn't need to tell it. There was a new face at the table that year, a woman my mother had befriended at church over the past few months, and so of course my mother handled the introductions herself, the way she always did. She swept her arm graciously toward the head of the table first. "That's my son Brandon," she said, glowing. "He just made partner at his firm, youngest one they've ever named." Then her eyes traveled slowly down the length of the table to my end, and her voice did the small, practiced drop it always did when it reached me. "And that's Evelyn. She never did finish school. She works at a little metal shop out in the county somewhere." She said it the exact way you'd mention a mild, ongoing inconvenience, a squeaky hinge you keep meaning to oil. The church friend gave me that particular soft smile, the pitying one I knew by heart. A year ago, that sentence would have burned in my chest for a solid week. This time, I just nodded, calm as a glass of still water, and reached over for the gravy boat. I had spent 7 long years learning how to hold that exact sentence without so much as flinching. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that I was about to watch it fall apart, all on its own, right there on the good tablecloth. It started, of all places, with Uncle Gary in the far corner, still half watching his phone under the table. His thumb stopped scrolling mid-swipe. He squinted down at the screen. He tilted it toward the light of the dining room chandelier and read something twice, his lips moving slightly. Then he said, straight into a small lull in the conversation, "Well, wait a minute." The whole table went quiet the way tables do when somebody's tone suddenly changes underneath the words. "Walsh Metalworks," Uncle Gary read out slowly, carefully, off his screen. "Local woman buys out longtime fabrication shop, saves 30 county jobs." He looked up from the phone, and he looked straight down the entire length of that long table right at me, at the wobbly chair. "Evelyn," he said, "hold on. Is this you? Walsh? That's us." Forks paused in midair up and down the table. 14 faces turned one after another in my direction. A slow wave rolling all the way down toward my end. My mother, caught halfway through a sentence about Brandon's promotion, stopped dead, with her mouth still open around the last word. Dana's article had gone live. Right then. Right in the middle of the turkey. There was nothing left to do but set down my fork. Uncle Gary started reading it out loud, because reading things out loud is simply what Uncle Gary does at a table. He read Dana's careful words into the sudden ringing silence of that dining room, line by line. That I had bought the shop outright from Hank Delgado when he retired. That I had saved the place from closing its doors for good. That when the biggest customer had walked out with no warning, I had personally saved the entire company in 72 hours, alone, with a job that 3 other shops had already called flat out impossible. That 30 people across the county still had steady paychecks that morning because of it. He read the part where the water plant's chief engineer was quoted saying, "Who else around here can do work like this?" And with every single line he read, the temperature in that room shifted a few more degrees. My father slowly set his knife down flat on his plate and stared at me like he was looking at a total stranger who happened to have his own eyes looking back. Brandon's face went a deep, blotchy red, his fresh partnership suddenly very small on the table between the two of us. And my mother. My mother had gone completely, utterly, dangerously still at the head of the table. I watched her under the chandelier light, and I could see her mind working behind her eyes, fast, the way it always worked a room. She was recalculating. 7 years of a story she'd told 100 times had just been contradicted, out loud, in her own dining room, in front of the church friend and the out-of-town cousins and everyone whose opinion she'd spent her life arranging. And I understood, watching her, that she wasn't ashamed. She wasn't sorry. She was doing the only thing she'd ever known how to do with a fact about her children. She was figuring out how to make it hers. And then my mother did the one thing I will never, as long as I live, forget. She recovered. In the space of a single breath, the very same woman who had introduced me as a family disappointment for 7 unbroken years reorganized her entire face into radiant, delighted pride. She reached out across 2 place settings, past the gravy and the cranberry, and she laid her warm hand on my shoulder. Warm, on me, for the first time in years, and she beamed out at all of them around the table. "I always knew," she announced, her voice ringing out clear and bright and completely certain. "Didn't I always say Evelyn was special? Didn't I always say it? My daughter. Everyone, look at my daughter." She gave my shoulder a little proprietary squeeze. "Tell them, sweetheart. Go on, tell them everything. Tell them all how you did it." And there it was, the exact moment I had lain awake dreaming about for 7 years, arriving at last, gift-wrapped and warm, set right down on my plate in front of me. All I had to do was open my mouth and take it. The whole table was leaning in toward me now, waiting, breathless. My mother was waiting, her hand still warm on my shoulder. My revenge was sitting right there, and it was mine for the taking. And it was so much sweeter than I'd ever imagined it. That was the trouble. I could stand up and lay out 7 years in front of these people, the broom, the calipers, the loan, the 4-line email, the 72 hours. and every relative who'd ever pitied me would have to sit there and eat it, course by course. Brandon would shrink. My father would have no idea what to say, and my mother would have to hear, in front of her church friend, that she'd been wrong about her own daughter for 7 straight years. I had wanted that so badly, for so long, that I could taste it. The taste is what stopped me. I knew that taste. It was hers. I looked at my mother's hand resting warm on my shoulder, and I understood something all at once, with a clarity that felt almost cold. If I told them everything now, the loan, the guarantee, the 72 hours, the whole hard, beautiful story of it, I would be handing my mother a brand new medal to pin on the family's chest and wear to church. She wouldn't be apologizing for 7 years of she dropped out. She would simply be trading it in, seamlessly, for I always knew she was special, and telling herself and everyone else that this had been the truth all along, and the terrible thing, the thing I saw in that frozen second, was that both versions ran on the exact same rule underneath. I was only worth loving out loud if I could be shown off to the room. The disgrace and the trophy were the same coin. She'd simply flipped it over, mid-dinner, the instant it started paying out. Taking the microphone now meant agreeing to her terms. It meant agreeing that my value was a thing this table got to grant me, or take away, depending on the year. For 7 years I had dreamed of this exact table finally going quiet for me, and now that it had, sitting inside the silence, I realized I didn't want the microphone at all. I wanted the door. I reached down and picked up my napkin from my lap, and I set it gently beside my plate. Here was the trap, dressed up as a gift. If I stood up and told the story, I'd win the room. But I'd lose the only thing the last 7 years had actually given me. I'd spent them learning that I did not need this table to certify me. Telling the story now would unlearn it in one night. It would say, out loud, that I'd been waiting for this all along, that the applause was the point, that she'd only ever had to clap and I'd have come running. And maybe 2 years ago that would have been true. It wasn't true anymore. The tin box on my wall had cured me of it. I wasn't going to hand her the pen back just because, for once, she was ready to write something kind. I stood up from the wobbly chair. My mother's hand slid off my shoulder and hung there in the air for a second before she lowered it. All 14 faces watched me rise, waiting for the speech, the vindication, the triumphant story of how the family dropout had shown every last one of them. I did not give it to them. I looked down the table at my mother, calm as still water, and I said the only thing that was actually worth saying in that room. I did finish something, Mom. I let it sit there for just a beat, in the quiet. I just stopped waiting for you to grade it. Nobody at that table moved a muscle. My mother's mouth opened, and for once in her entire life, nothing came out of it. I turned then to the rest of the table, to my father, to Brandon, to Katie, to Uncle Gary with his phone still glowing in his hand. Thank you for dinner, I said, and I meant it plainly. Everything was lovely. And then I did the one thing that 7 years in that folding chair had never once allowed me to do. I walked away from that table on my own 2 feet, while it was still, for once, my turn to talk. I left them sitting there in the silence they had always left for me. I made it out to the front porch before I heard the door open behind me, and then small, quick footsteps on the boards. Katie, in her holiday dress, breathless, having slipped away from the table. Aunt Evelyn, she said, looking up at me. Was that the metal shop? The one where you fix things? I crouched down to her level one more time, there in the cold porch light. That's the one, I told her. I own it now. The whole thing. Her eyes went absolutely huge in her little face. You own a whole entire shop? I nodded. I do. I put my hand on her shoulder. You remember what I told you in the driveway? Nobody grades your life but you. Not even at a big fancy table with a nice tablecloth. She threw both arms around my neck and squeezed, and over the top of her head I saw Brandon come out onto the porch behind her. His hands shoved down in his pockets, his face unsure of itself. "Ev," he said quietly. "That article. I swear I didn't know. None of us knew any of it." He looked for the first time in years like my actual brother standing there, and not a law degree and a nice sweater. "I'm sorry," he said. And it wasn't everything. It didn't undo 7 years. But it was true, and it was entirely his own, and I reached out and took it from him. I drove home through the early dark with the radio switched off, just the hum of the tires and my own breathing. And I kept waiting for the triumph to finally hit me, the hot, rushing wave of having at last, publicly, won. It never came. What came instead was something lighter and, honestly, so much better. A kind of deep quiet I hadn't felt in years, like the feeling of finally setting down a weight you've carried so long that you'd genuinely forgotten it was ever optional to put it down. My phone buzzed once against the passenger seat. A text from my mother. Just one fumbling, uncertain line. "We should talk." I didn't realize. I glanced at it at a red light. The words lit up blue in the dark cab. And then I set the phone face down on the seat. Not out of any cruelty. I just didn't need her to realize anymore. That, in the end, was the entire point of everything. I turned onto my own street, toward my own house, the one I'd put on the line and fought to keep, and I let the small yellow porch light of it be the only welcome home I needed. The morning after Thanksgiving, I let myself into the shop while it was still dark outside and quiet, the machines cold and sleeping, the whole place mine and no one else's. I went into the office that used to be Hank's and was mine now, and I took Nan's dented tin out of my bag and opened it on the desk. I pulled out the photograph of the 12-year-old girl elbow deep in the broken box fan and the IOU in Nan's shaky, careful hand. "For work well done." I found a pushpin in the drawer and I tacked them both to the wall directly above my desk, right where I'd see them every single morning for the rest of my working life. Then I just stood there for a while in the gray light coming through the high windows, in the good smell of cutting oil and cold steel, standing right in the middle of the thing I had built with my own 2 hands while everyone I was related to was looking the other way. Nan had been right about me. She'd been right since I was 12 years old with a screwdriver. Work you can hold in your hands is never a disappointment. I flipped on the lights, one bank at a time, and I got ready to make payroll. My family did not magically transform after that Thanksgiving. That isn't how it works, and I won't pretend it is. My mother and I are polite now, careful with each other, at a distance that honestly suits us both better than anything before it did. She never quite apologized, not in real words, and somewhere in there I stopped needing her to. She will always measure people by what she can show them off for. It's how she survived her own hard-judged life, and I've made my peace with understanding that about her without excusing it or fixing it. Brandon calls sometimes now, just to talk. At the next family gathering that spring, he introduced me himself, before my mother could get to it. "This is my sister Evelyn," he said. "She owns Walsh Metalworks." A small thing. It mattered more than he knew. And on a quiet Saturday that winter, I brought Katie down to the shop and stood behind her while she made her first weld ever, her little hands steady inside the big leather gloves, her whole face lit up gold in the light of the arc. Nobody in that shop was waiting for her to be anything other than exactly what she was. The chain that had run straight through my family for 2 full generations stopped, quietly, without ceremony, on a Saturday afternoon, in a room that smelled like hot steel. Turns out the diploma I needed most was the one that said I could stop asking permission to be proud of myself, and nobody hands you that one. You sign it yourself. That's the story. The tin box, the 4-line email, the chair I sat in doing the math on my own house. If you've ever been somebody's quiet disappointment while you were secretly building a whole life they never saw coming, then this channel is your table. Subscribe, and I'll save you a seat at the end.